They say we stand for nothing and there's no way we ever could. Now we see everything that's going wrong with the world and those who lead it. We just feel like we don't have the means to rise above and beat it. So we keep waiting, waiting on the world to change. We keep on waiting, waiting on the world to change. It's hard to beat the system when we're standing at a distance. So we keep waiting, waiting on the world to change. Now if we had the power to bring our neighbors home from war, they would have never missed a Christmas. No more ribbons on your door. When you trust your television, what you get is what you got. Cause when they own the information, oh, they can bend it all they want. That's why we're waiting, waiting on the world to change. We keep on waiting, waiting on the world to change. It's not that we don't care, we just know that the fight ain't fair. So we keep waiting, waiting on the world to change.
I can't change, even if I tried, even if I wanted to. I can't change, even if I tried, even if I wanted to. My love, my love, my love, she keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. My love, my love, my love, she keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. My love, my love, my love.
People get ready, the trains are coming. Don't need no baggage, just
You ready? Good afternoon, I'm Susan Leslie, and is the mic not sounding so good? I'm Susan Leslie, and I'm the UUA's Congregational Advocacy and Witness Director, and it's my privilege to present to you today a really unique partnership, both of UU congregations and with NAACP North Carolina Forward Together and Democracy North Carolina and others. So you're going to hear a rich story here today from Reverend Rob Hardies, Senior Minister, All Souls Unitarian, Washington, D.C., Reverend J. Leach, Senior Minister at UU Church of Charlotte, Pam Coukos, Coordinator for the James Reeb Project at All Souls Unitarian, and Reverend Patrice Curtis, who's also a minister at All Souls Unitarian. And so with that, I am going to turn the panel over to them. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here for this workshop. We are here this week to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Selma and to honor those who sacrificed, even unto death, for the right to vote. You know, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is the singular legislative achievement of the Selma struggle, and it's considered by many to be one of the most successful pieces of civil rights legislation ever. It's helped enfranchise millions of Black and later Latino voters. But 50 years later, we stand here in Alabama not to celebrate the advancing cause of voting rights, but rather to see a struggle that is in fact in retreat. How did that happen? How did that happen? Well, we know part of the story, right? We know that the Supreme Court in 2013 in the Shelby v. Holder decision effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act, at least the ability of the Justice Department to enforce that Voting Rights Act. And we know that in states across the country, extremist legislatures have been passing voter laws that are designed to make it harder for people to vote, to restrict access to the ballot, to shrink polling places and polling hours and polling days, and to have more stringent voter ID laws. Why? Why in a democracy would you want to make it harder for people to vote? Could it be that the Voting Rights Act was too successful for its own good? Could it be that because in the election of 2012, the most diverse electorate in the history of America re-elected America's first Black president? Does anyone here think it's a coincidence that this voter suppression wave happened after that election? No. Emma Goldman, the great radical and anarchist who frankly didn't have much use for voting herself, she was an anarchist, she once said, you know, if voting actually changed anything, they'd make it illegal. Well, it did, and they're trying. They're trying. And speaking for our church, at least, we're not just going to sit around and watch while that happens. For us at All Souls Church in Washington, D.C., this voting rights struggle is deeply personal. It's personal in part because we live in the nation's capital, where we ourselves are disenfranchised, where we still do not have a vote in Congress. Okay, so we know something about what it means to be disenfranchised, but it's also personal because, of course, of our relationship to Jim Reeb, who for 6 years, until just a few months before his death, was the associate minister at All Souls Church. And you know, in our congregation today, there are still folks, couples, who were married by Jim Reeb. There are folks whose children were blessed and dedicated by him in our sanctuary. And I'm very aware every Sunday when I step into the pulpit that I'm preaching from a pulpit in which Jim Reeb preached and prayed and taught for 6 years. 50 years ago, the minister of our church gave his life for the right to vote. And so we are not going to watch while the Supreme Court and state legislatures in this country take that right away. So, not too long after the Shelby decision, we created the Reeb Voting Rights Project at All Souls Church in honor of our former associate minister. And we've seen this ministry take off in the last 2 years at church, really involving nearly half of our congregation of about 1,000 members. It's been a really successful ministry and something that the congregation has really been engaged in. I just want to share with you a little bit about how one congregation is taking steps to kind of address this issue of voting rights. So, first of all, we have, as a congregation, and your congregation can do this too, have joined a national coalition of religious institutions of many faiths who are working to restore the Voting Rights Act. Okay, this is an important issue that's before Congress. It's not a perfect bill. We want to change the bill that's before Congress, but there is an interfaith coalition led by Bending the Arc, a Jewish justice organization that is working on this issue of voting rights, and we're part of that coalition. Encourage you to join it as well. A year ago, on the anniversary of the Shelby decision, we wanted to find some way to tell the Supreme Court, you guys really screwed up, with this decision in Shelby. Of course, we know that the justices don't really listen to that kind of feedback, but we at least wanted other folks to know. So we took to the steps of the Supreme Court and we did this flash mob on the first anniversary of Shelby. We had about 250 people from our congregation participate in that. It got picked up by the HuffPost, by Jon Stewart, by Upworthy, and several other social media sites, and has done really well on YouTube, kind of drawing people into this cause of voting rights. So that's another piece that we did. A year ago, on the anniversary of the Selma March, we gathered with Reverend Dr. Barber on the steps of the Capitol to witness for voting rights. And so we're trying to leverage our position in the nation's capital to help bring this fight to the steps of the Capitol. But the other thing that we're doing, and I think this is really important, is that we're working in one of the states that's been hardest hit by these voter suppression laws, and that's in the state of North Carolina. So, right after the Shelby decision, we were saying to ourselves, what can we do to be in solidarity with this struggle for voting rights? And we were just so inspired by the work that Reverend Barber is doing, by the remarkable coalition that he has brought together, that I think is really one of the most exciting coalitions in the progressive movement today. I don't see anything more exciting than this in the movement, and so we wanted to be a part of that. But I also have to say that we were so moved and inspired by the witness of our Unitarian Universalist congregations and colleagues in North Carolina. going to jail, showing up, and marching, that we said, can we be in partnership with you all? Can we help support? We got a lot of folks, we got a lot of energy, there's a lot of work to be done, we know. Is there any way that we can help? And so over the last year or so, we have been working closely with our two congregations in Charlotte, the Piedmont congregation and the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Charlotte, and to work on voter education, voter registration, and voter turnout. We've been down to Charlotte several times over the last year or so for moral marches, for a voter registration drive last fall. But you don't have to go to North Carolina. A lot of this work can be done from your own church fellowship hall. So in the weeks leading up to the election last year, we phone banked right there in Washington, D.C., and members of All Souls Church contacted about 10,000 Charlotte voters from Washington, D.C. We worked in really close partnership with Democracy North Carolina, who gave us call lists, who gave us precinct lists, and really were able to seamlessly work, those of us from D.C. kind of into that struggle. So we're really grateful to the folks in North Carolina, the NAACP, Democracy North Carolina, but especially our UU colleagues and congregations in Charlotte who hosted us and provided hospitality and have been just, great partners in this work. So we're trying to work, on the state level as well. But I have to tell you, this week I have been inspired to think, gosh, how could we think bigger? How can we, what would it mean, for instance, if Unitarian Universalists in all the states that are affected by these voter suppression laws paired up with the NAACP or another institution in those states and really made voting rights a priority? And what if those congregations each partnered with another congregation that's not in that state, that's in a state maybe that's not affected by the voter suppression laws, and worked in partnership together? What would it take to make this a real national movement and priority among Unitarian Universalists? That's the kind of energy that I'm feeling here from this week, and I'm trying to think about how we can make that happen. The other thing I want to say is some of us are in states that aren't affected by these voter suppression laws. What role do we have to play in addition to being in solidarity with folks who are? And it strikes me that maybe the next step for those of us in blue states, if you will, is to take a different approach. What if we worked instead on really making sure that our states modeled the best practices, had the most kind of progressive voting rights laws in the country? Oregon just passed a great example of expanding access to the ballot. What if each of our states, that's something we can do in Washington, D.C., pass model legislation that then is an example for states where we can show, gosh, look at this kind of legislation, look at the voter turnout that you can get if you have this kind of legislation, and then compare it to some of these other states that are struggling. So those are some of the ideas that have come up for me during just this week. But I just want to say that, as Reverend Barber has said, we're not just here to celebrate this week, we're here to consecrate. And to dedicate ourselves to this struggle. Last night I met Marie Reeb for the first time, and I promised to her that we at All Souls were going to continue this struggle in her husband's name, and I hope we can all make that promise. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Jay Leach, and I'm the minister of the UU congregation in Charlotte, North Carolina, along with my colleague who is tending to one of her twins, I think, right at this moment at our sister congregation. at the Piedmont Unitarian Universalist Congregation. Isn't it wonderful to be a part of a religious movement that cares enough to create a gathering like this at a time like this? And aren't you proud of who we are, that we take time out of our lives to come here and pay attention because it matters? Give yourselves an applause for that one. My guess is not one of you's in the room because you couldn't think of anything else to do this weekend, right? So having said that, I want to call out one little piece of this. Last summer, we said to our 8-year-old, and before you say it, I understand, there are a lot of people that think I'm her grandfather, but that's a whole other issue. So we said to our 8-year-old that we want to take you to Selma to celebrate and to commemorate and to pay homage to our forebears. And along the process, we invited a friend of hers and her mom to join us. And so that was the focus for us. And as we went to register for this and discovered there wasn't a single thing for children scheduled, we knew we still have work to do as a movement. We've got to get our children in these rooms too. And I don't mean our youth, I mean our children, to understand that this matters. If they don't get it, and if they don't catch the fire from you, then this won't last. So we've made a choice, and I felt I had to offer an explanation because I understand my friend Bill Barber called me out this morning for not being here. And there's a part of me that likes that because we jab back and forth all the time, and there's a part of me that likes that he knows I didn't show up to hear him this time. But so I wanted to offer that contextualization. So we're traveling as a family and made our way through the King Center and Ebenezer and the Birth House yesterday and the Civil Rights Museum today and 16th Street Church, and we'll be with you in Selma tomorrow. So it saddens me not to get to be here and take advantage of this. But I do want to say we've got to find ways. You've got to find ways. When you do stuff that matters, you've got to find a way to get your children involved, not in childcare, in what's going on. So as Rob said, you may have heard one or two things about some challenges we're facing in North Carolina, perhaps. They're true. And whatever you've heard, I promise you is not an exaggeration. Let me say a little bit for those of you who don't know about North Carolina. North Carolina is one of the purplest states in the country. Surprises some people. In 2008, we, by a very thin margin, backed Obama for president. In 2012, by a very thin margin, we backed Romney for president. That's our state. We're very, very divided. And there are increasing numbers of us in North Carolina, who cannot possibly live with an R or a D after our names because we understand that we have to be about something bigger than that nonsense. So if you look at North Carolina, our registration is going the way of most of the rest of the country in that the unaffiliated voters are a larger and larger percentage of our state. So in true sort of Southern Democratic fashion, the Democrats had run Raleigh, our state capital, for a very, very long time. And part of the story that we don't tell is they had made an utter and complete mess of it. There were unethical things being done. There are people serving sentences right now at high levels. There was a speaker in our house that was taking bags of money in a men's room, a Democrat. A couple of governors been indicted. So this is not good guys, bad guys we're playing in North Carolina. I don't know what the story is in your state, but I know in my state, this is not good guys, bad guys. Barber started what he's doing right now when the Democrats were in charge. So that's part of the story you don't hear. So Barber was actively challenging our state government when the Democrats were in charge. So all of this nonsense about this being a partisan movement and he's been baptized by the Democratic Party and all of this is not historically accurate. He started this because he recognized that North Carolina was not who North Carolina could and should be. And so the HK on J, the Moral March that some of you, how many of you have been to Raleigh? Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You cannot imagine, those of us who've been on the front line of this struggle, how heartened we've been by seeing you with us in the streets of Raleigh, because North Carolina's a tough place to be right now. So thank you. HK on J just had its 9th march. So the takeover of Republicans of our governor's office and of both parts of our legislature has happened since HK on J was going, right? So it's important to know. Let me say a little bit about why I think the Forward Together movement has been so effective and what I think we have to learn from that, and parts of which I hope you can take back. One of the amazing things is to see how Moral Monday has spread across the country. There's 3 things that I think are worth paying attention to. The first is, and some of you heard me say this in Raleigh last year, the first is this is an unabashedly religious, spiritual movement. Barber has reclaimed the language of religion. He's reclaimed the language of spirituality. It's called Moral Monday for a reason. And part of the effectiveness of his rhetoric is this is not the God-hating secularists who aren't like any of the rest of us up against all of us blue-blooded Americans. Barber got that clearly. And there's a reason he uses the language he does. There are actually 2 reasons. One is because he knows strategically how effective that rhetoric is, not just in North Carolina, but in the country. When you can talk about moral language and you can talk about this being a religious movement and you can ground it in the values of spirituality, it has a kind of power. The other reason is Barber doesn't have another language, right? That's his language, right? So he's not playing a game with us. So those of you who I understand, some of you heard him on Thursday. Yeah, so that's not, I mean, that's who he is. And I can tell you, you got so lucky this morning because of Melissa Harris Perry, who you should send a letter of appreciation to, that he had to leave because you'd still be listening to him if he hadn't had something else to do. I was telling a couple of people before, he asked for the chance to preach at the UU Church in Charlotte last fall, and I'd asked for a resume and, what have you done that would make us give you our esteemed pulpit? And he sort of passed that test, so we decided we'd go ahead and have him. So in the 9:15 service, he preached for 50 minutes. And in the 11:15 service, he preached for an hour. And we got back together for a community gathering on Sunday afternoon, at which point he preached for an hour and 10 minutes. So I told people I looked at the back of Bill Barber for 3 hours in one day. So you heard Barber, that's his language, but the language plays, and it is time for us to get past being hung up about language and trying to pass everything through some tiny little narrow sieve of your own personal linguistic comfort level and understand that we're not going to get anything done until we stop being so petty and running. I'm a transfer into Unitarian Universalism. One of the reasons it took me so long is because I was doing so much interfaith work and I experienced the Unitarian Universalists as the language police. That was their primary role, is to tell the rest of us what we couldn't and shouldn't say. We've got to get past that. So it's interesting to me to have been on a bus full of people coming back from the march a few weeks ago from Raleigh, members of our congregation, and have one of our die-hard humanists say, "Oh my God, that guy's great." And I'm thinking, did you hear what he said? Really? That's the first thing. This has to be a religious, spiritual, moral movement. And he understands that. The second thing is this has to be an umbrella movement. When you participate in the Moral Mondays and all the other things that we've done, Planned Parenthood is there. Environmentalists are there. University professors are there. Physicians are there. Undocumented workers are there. Teachers are there. go down the line. What he understands is there's a moral imperative that's larger than your little issue. And we've got to understand that we can't stay in that little framework and just work on one issue. This is all of a piece. Barber gets that, and one of the reasons it's been so effective, I think, in North Carolina is because he's made the tent big enough. And let me address one issue in particular. When I first went to Raleigh and talked with Barber, I said, we'd be here anyway. But we owe you a debt of gratitude because when finally, this was blocked year after year after year after year in our state legislation, when Amendment 1 was finally put before the voters of North Carolina, an anti-marriage equality amendment, Barber barnstormed the state in opposition. He paid a huge price from the African American church. Now, I said to him, we owe you a debt of gratitude. We're here in part just to thank you for doing that. I spoke over and over and over in opposition to the amendment and did all kinds of press conferences and one thing and another. And Barber looked at me and he said, you know what that was about? I said, no, but I have the feeling you're getting ready to tell me. I'm just tired of people hating on each other. That was it. I wish I had been smart enough to say that all the times the press asked me. We're just tired of people hating on each other, and sit down. That's who he is, and we've never had a gathering in Raleigh where Barber doesn't say, we're here as people of faith, people who struggle with faith, and people with no faith. We're here as straight, as gay, as lesbian, as bisexual, as transgender. We're here as rich, as poor, as Republican. He understands this has to be an umbrella. The third thing is he grounds this historically. And Susan, let's get that piece. Can we embed that piece on the material that people will get? There's a piece that we were going to show, and we're not going to take the time to do that, but there's a piece of Barber's historical understanding of politics. He's brilliant about North Carolina history, and he understands that if you look at North Carolina political history, coming out of the Civil War, our General Assembly was incredibly racially diverse. So if you look at political power in North Carolina in the 1870s and 1880s and into the 1890s, we had an incredibly racially diverse General Assembly. Then comes the backlash. If you've been to the Civil Rights Museum, you saw that played out in another way here in Alabama. Same thing. And a coalition on the other side that decided we really don't like this kind of political power being in the hands of the African American community. And so there's a backlash against that. And then comes, he walks us through the civil rights movement and the backlash against that. And now he says, North Carolina had the audacity in 2008 to vote for an African American for president. There's no question about where this comes from. We've seen this before. And as in Barber's inimitable way, he says, they don't even have a new playbook. All they've done is dusted off a playbook from the 19th century, which is what's going on in North Carolina. We have to know our history because the way we talk about history affects who we can communicate with. And I want to very gently point something. I just saw somebody touting our relationship to Taft, right? I mean, he's the one president we know was one of us. I mean, you don't have to, say, Taft. How many of you know about Taft's ideological identity? So when we say we're the religion of William Howard Taft, isn't this wonderful? William Howard Taft started the Republican move into the South. And he decided he would win white Southern voters by refusing. I want you to listen to this. Read Patrice Sullivan's History of the NAACP. By refusing to condemn lynching in the South. William Howard Taft, our man. So when we say we're the religion of William Howard, look at him. He's one of us. think about how that plays. So when we raise questions about why it's so hard for us to be racially diverse, part of it is because we don't know history. And part of it is because the way we tell the story alienates people. I don't want to be the religion of William Howard Taft. I'm sure he had worth and dignity. God bless his soul. But if we're going to find heroes, let's don't use people who are so tainted in perception. So Barbara understands our history and contextualizes what we do in that way. If Susan's not holding up a sign that my time's up, she should be, but she's giving me the finger. I knew that was going to happen. So I want to finally thank our friends here. We've been trying to work as a congregation. We've been participating actively in the Moral Monday movement. There's so much work to do in North Carolina. And it is so exhausting to do that work. And it was like a breath of fresh air and a cold drink of water when these folks said, can we partner with you? Can we come to North Carolina? And we spent a beautiful weekend together framing it. We had a service Patrice led, and then went out into the streets, knocking on doors, registering voters over and over and over all day long. And then came back together to worship on Sunday morning together. It was powerful. And one of the things it did was it so heartened people in our congregation that we're not in this struggle alone. Don't kid yourselves. We're not all on the same page. I preached last year in the great blue state of Minnesota, right? And I talked about voting rights, and a guy came up to me afterward, a Unitarian Universalist, actively involved in his congregation, and said, I'm for fair elections. I don't know how you could be against photo IDs. So, look, he's a part of us. We need to understand that. Not all the work is them. Not all the work is them. We need to understand that there's work we have to do within ourselves and not make assumptions. One of my responses to him, we were talking about this just before, one of my responses to him is, I'm assuming that means you're working on absentee voting. Because voter IDs don't have anything to do about absentee voting. So if you're really concerned about fair elections, then surely you're going to figure out a way for us to be fair in our absentee voting. Or is it that conservatives way outvote progressives absentee, and let's don't mess with that. So my final thing, I promise you. There's a sheet here. Susan has them. You want to send them around? This sort of documents what we're up against in North Carolina. And if you feel like you have no identity with this, then good. We didn't either until very recently. There are people shocked that this could happen in North Carolina. This tells you why we're doing the work we're doing. This is also going to be posted on the material that you'll get in response to the conference so that you can see what this legislation looks like. Most of this we know doesn't come from North Carolina. This doesn't come from This is straight off of the ALEC fax machine. All right, so the legislation looks remarkably similar from state to state because the state legislatures aren't writing the legislation. It's coming down from the lobbyist, whole portions of which, paragraphs of which, were lifted straight from a lobbyist into our new voter suppression law. We had the problem in North Carolina. Terrible problem. We went from one of the lowest voter turnout states to one of the highest voter turnout states because we did some stuff to make voting more accessible. We expanded early voting. We had a wonderful program where 16 and 17-year-olds could pre-register in their high schools. So when they turned 18, they were registered voters. Guess what? We don't have that anymore because, God, if there's a fraudulent group in this country, it's those damn 16, 17-year-olds trying to take over the election process, right? Yeah, don't laugh. You know, they're horrible. Oh, my God. You can't keep them out of the right? So you can read some of this. All of what we did, we had Sunday voting. African American congregations had souls to the polls. After the service, buses came. They took people to the voting places. Wonderful. Wonderful. People invested in the process. They cared about the outcome. We made it possible. All that's been changed. And you can read about this here and see what we're up against. And notice also that this is coming around into some places you might not expect. I'm way over my time. Thank you.
So I think you've gotten a great, starting this morning and through this afternoon, laying out of the challenges we face, the importance of what we're doing. I'm going to take you into some nuts and bolts. So I'm going to talk about how we got to the kinds of things that Rob described, how we got to close to 50% of the entire active congregation being on my email list, and all the things we've been able to do. And this has been great. I've been going to school for 2 days with my civil rights movement elders and our leaders that we heard from today. And I guess I feel a little good that some of the things I'm going to tell you that I think were part of our success, they're going to sound very familiar. These are sort of classic tactics that have worked for us, and I'm going to put them out in hopes they're helpful to you. So in the fall of 2013, a small group of us started talking about how to take the energy we felt at our anger with the Supreme Court decision and what it meant for our legacy and turning into some kind of action. We had a small team. There were 3 of us at first, along with Rob and Kathy Ryan Starr, who was our former social justice minister. And right there, that's a piece of the story. We had a real engagement between lay leadership and clergy to build this from the beginning. And we thought, well, let's just do something. Let's just try something. And the UUA had asked everyone to come to Raleigh for the Moral March in 2014. And we thought, well, that's perfect, right? It's concrete. It's a specific thing we can ask people to do now to carry out this commitment. And we can test our capacity. We can see how much people are ready to do. Are you ready to make the sacrifice of time and resources to travel somewhere else and do something? And what's our own capacity to support that? And because we wanted to be accountable, we set a goal. We said, we're not just going to tell people to go, we're going to sign up and be accountable for 50 members of our congregation to be marching together on the streets of Raleigh. We're going to have a list of who they are, we're going to make sure they get there, and that's our goal. And that seemed kind of intimidating, that seemed like a lot, but then Rob kind of lit a fire under everybody from the pulpit, and it just grew. I mean, people blew the doors off this thing. So we ended up with something like 200 members of our congregation who came down and participated in that. And then we were left with what you call a good problem to have. Okay, people want to do this. What are we going to do next? So that brings me to my first piece of advice. So if they come, you have to build it. You have to respond to that energy and drive with something that people can do and a structure that supports them, right? And we all know from what we've been hearing and from what we know already, right, the secret sauce is that, this stuff isn't spontaneous. This stuff is planned and organized. And we maybe have a philosophy that isn't so into structure, discipline, but this is part of what's made movement successful. So we had a mission statement. We had 4 objectives. We have 4 objectives. They are to influence the national conversation about voting rights. They are to take action in solidarity with North Carolina, where there is state-level disenfranchisement. They are to recognize and act on our own disenfranchisement in the District of Columbia, where we have taxation without representation, and to do all this work and build the beloved community. So we started there with some objectives with our team. We used a lot of tools. We used email and Google Docs and paper lists and accountability. Sign people up, make sure they come, call them, remind them, thank them afterwards, tell them what's next. Okay? People get an email from our team about every couple of weeks with, here's what we've done, here's what's happening, here's how you can get engaged. So they don't get too much, but they get a regular kind of communication. We found the resources within our own congregation. So we have somebody in our organizing team who was an IAF youth organizer, right? He's awesome at thinking about leadership development and one-on-one engagement and volunteers. We have people who have really good technical skills, right, who can help us with data and all of that piece. We have people who are teachers and trainers, people who know about voting rights because they work on the issue. We have somebody who's one of our founders who has long been a key member of our congregation in terms of our anti-racism work, and she has made sure that that is a piece of the story, and you're going to hear a little bit more about that later. So we found all the things that we've got, and we tried to put them together, right? And then we had to have things for people to do. So we started at home, right? We started at home. We did some teach-in sessions. We brought in people to talk about voting rights. We built some relationships within our congregation. And we did this video project because that was a fun and energizing action that, people could do. And then we turned to how we could actually work on the ground in North Carolina. So that's the second point is it's called community organizing for a reason, right? So community organizing is driven by the needs of the community, right? So coming in as an outside ally, right, our job is not to pick the strategy. Our job is to say, we have capacity. How is that of benefit to what you are trying to accomplish? And we reached out to Democracy North Carolina, which is a nonpartisan grassroots organization. They are very engaged in voter education and mobilizing democracy within the state. And the other thing that I thought was important is that they're really data-driven. They're really thinking about ways to organize based on what we know about voters, and so they could give us some really specific things to do. And we reached out and engaged our partner congregations in North Carolina. And we did a lot of great stuff that you heard about already. A side note on the question about engaging families. So we encourage families to go to Raleigh. We tried to make that part of what we were doing. We tried to find other ways. You saw kids in our video. It's not always possible, but it is an important way to keep people engaged. So the third thing I wanted to mention is summed up by, I get by with little help from my friends. Okay, so relationship-based organizing has been incredibly important to our project. It started with that first group of folks. We were actually already friends. Part of what we were excited about was spending time with each other, and we still are. The stories you heard about our trip to North Carolina, I mean, it was just a beautiful thing to spend time with other UUs and share this work. When we went out door to door, we built the teams so that you were with somebody from one of the other churches, right? And people would spent like 4 hours together, right? And I was sending people out with their lists, and I was watching them when they came back. And they went out as strangers, and they came back as friends. And you could see it when they walked in, how they were talking to each other and talking to us about what they had done together. I say that the Reeb project is my covenant group, That's what I get out of it. That feeds that piece for me. And it provides the resiliency. I think we heard about resiliency this morning, and it's true. Boy, it's hard. It's depressing. It's demoralizing. We haven't told you about all the things that didn't work. We haven't told you about the failures and the mistakes, but just say that they were there. They happened. And you need people to pick you back up and say, well, yeah, let's just try that again. And I'm still here for you. And that, I think, is what's going to make this sustainable for us over the long haul. So that's all I wanted to say. We'll have more questions, and I'm going to turn over to Patrice.
Afternoon. So I'd like to read a pledge to you. I hereby pledge myself, my person, and my body to the nonviolent movement. Therefore, I will keep the following 10 commandments. Meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus. Remember always that the nonviolent movement seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. Walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. Pray daily to be used by God in order that all men might be free. Sacrifice personal wishes in order that all men might be free. Observe, with both friend and foe, the ordinary rules of courtesy. Seek to perform regular service for others and for the world. Refrain from the violence of fist, tongue, or heart. Strive to be in good spiritual and bodily health. And last, follow the directions of the movement and of the captain on a demonstration. I sign this pledge having seriously considered what I do and with the determination and will to persevere. That is the commitment card, and it was called a commitment card, that folks in 1963 were asked to sign by the Southern leadership, the Southern Christian Leadership Council. This is often a piece of the civil rights movement that I find gets lost, and that is what was behind the ability of people to stand in the face of getting beaten by table legs and getting bit by dogs and getting spit upon and arrested and arrested and arrested. It's because there was a spiritual grounding to what they did. So there's 3 parts of the work that we've done at the Reeb Project. The first one is to have a covenant, and Pam talked about that, the 4 points. You might have noticed the 4th one was to build the beloved community. That's a phrase we often use, but in everything that I've had the pleasure to work with the Reeb community, because it was started before I was there, I have found that the group lives into that and is always looking for ways in which to be intentional about building the beloved community. The second part of this is also sort of public-facing, and that is being in relationship with the groups that you are working with toward a common goal. There is also, when you do that work, you are going to be stepping into the other, right? You're going to be stepping over a line, perhaps you're stepping out of your culture, working with NAACP, or you might not be an environmentalist and you're working with an environmental group, or women's rights might not be your main issue, but you're working with people who are very passionate about that. It requires you to we've got to sort of check our own cultural expectations at the door, and to be open to hear, well, how are others living their lives? How are others living into the work? What is the spiritual grounding of other folks? And we got a chance to see that Thursday night, right? I have seen Reverend William Berber preach at Charlotte Church, and I was really looking forward to seeing him preach in what I called his native land, right, which was his church. And it was very different, and it was very powerful. But when he preached at Charlotte Church, he did check some of his, right? It's not that he was still authentically himself, but he also realized that he was talking to a slightly different religious body and may have to sort of tone down things like, blood of Christ, for example. And so we have to be willing to go into their space and not always expect them to come into our space. And that is spiritual work. And the third piece of that spiritual work is our individual work, the work that we do in the privacy of our homes. When we think about who is in our orbit, right, our daily orbit, are we actually stretching beyond? Are we stretching into a place where we are uncomfortable? We've heard both Mark Morrison Reed talk about being in relationship. We talked about William Berber talked about being in relationship. Reverend C.T. Vivian talked about love. The other piece, that love, is about agape. Not eros, but agape. That love that Martin Luther King also called on. That creative love that builds community. And it really starts in each of our own hearts. We know where we are individually, whether we are willing to share that or not. We know what our individual challenges are. We know the folks that make us uncomfortable. And we have to challenge ourselves to step a little bit into that space and to keep stepping into that space. And in fact, what we want to do is we want to offer radical hospitality. The hospitality of the one-on-one, the hospitality of working in relationship with the others, the hospitality that we have to offer to those that don't believe like we do. Tired of people hating on each other. That is a spiritual work that we all have to do every day. If we keep that in mind, there is no way we cannot win. There is no way we cannot see that community of love. It starts in our heart, goes to our own community, right? Our own UU churches. Goes from there to those that we're working with in community, and goes beyond that to those who want to see a different kind of world. Thank you.
So this panel's actually been very concise, and we have about 15 minutes for discussion, so please just come up to the mic and they'll engage with you.
Sure. No problem.
What's important to me, I was starting from my journey at home and arriving to this moment, is that I'm the only person that I've connected with from Florida, that big red state. And I'm feeling a little confused by that from the standpoint that in this country, in my lifetime, things start in Iowa and they finish in that red state. And somehow when I hear you talk about the South, I don't feel mentioned, I don't feel included. Because when I hear about Florida, I hear about South Florida, that other Florida, little Haiti, little Cuba, whatever. But there's that Pensacola, lower Alabama component that needs help. I did what I know and what I learned to be grassroots politics this morning in trying to get the attention of Dr. Reverend Barber, that in Pensacola, Florida, we have just had the honor of a young woman taking on the job of doing her dissertation on the sit-ins in the 60s in 1960 to 62, when I was a youth council NAACP member, and to take that risk was near life-threatening. My sister was the first NAACP queen to raise monies to do that. Well, at any rate, what I'm trying to say to you is we now have a document where people who are alive, like myself and older than myself, have given testimony on that experience, and certainly any movement can learn from that. And so I'm appealing to you to tell me what's the next step when I leave here to make somebody pay attention to that, because I think it's the kind of, what do you call the little flicker on the stove that, you know, that can put the, okay, because in next month, the end of next month, we have gotten the state of Florida and the Escambia County to approve a marker in downtown. That is you have no idea. At the same time that we're fighting to not put back up the Dixie flag. Okay, so that's a strange kind of place to be. But historically, people in my hometown, in Escambia County, are frightened of, and they're coached and they're corralled and we're nurtured, and you know, we're well taken care of niggas, okay, in our own right. But I had to leave there, as you say in the spiritual tone, because Jesus had to leave home, because I know more and I know better, and I know, you know, that there's so much more that can be done and I've done and been a part of, that I'm still looking back at my hometown and people are stuck in an angry place, in a hurting place. And so we need recognition. They need attention, because we actually had to go, and it's just, when I say we, it's me from Gainesville, my sister, the young woman that did the dissertation, and one other young woman trying to put this thing together, okay? The NAACP did not even pay her any attention in terms of what she's doing, the local leadership there. So we've had to go beyond them to get some kind of control to go to the regional of the NAACP. Now, you have an ear with the board member. Help me help my hometown.
You're not going to respond? I have a totally different question. So, my name is Chris Hager. I am from the River Road Unitarian Universalist congregation in Bethesda, Maryland. But I want to put on my Legal Women Voters hat. And the League has worked against voter suppression laws in many states. We have in Maryland I live in one of the most liberal districts in the country, Van Hollen's district. I live in one of the most liberal districts within that in the country. We have some of the most liberal voter laws in the country. We had a 23% turnout last year, and in my district, we had a 17% turnout. I want to send an editorial next time saying, how dare you not vote? So is there anything that you can say that could engage more people to actually turn out and vote?
Yeah, I just wondered what your reaction would be to the idea of expanding the Reeb project to include the daughter congregations in the D.C. area.
I do, in fact, have the answer about voter turnout, but because I know it and I know so many people want it, I'm going to sell it, so I can't tell you right now. Actually, it's the issue we're all struggling with, and it goes back to what I was saying. Whenever I vote, I always take my daughter. So we always laugh. She votes twice in every election. So, I mean, I think that's part of it. And we've got to see this in the long haul. I've heard Doc say so many times to us in North Carolina, and I see my beloved colleague Mark Ward here from Asheville, and Mark knows this. Doc keeps saying, when King came to Washington and asked us to march, he didn't say stay in Washington. He said, go back to Alabama, and go back to Mississippi, and go back to Georgia, and go back to South Carolina, and whatever. And that's, the work is local, and part of it is that Barbara keeps saying, I can't lead the nation. I'm effective in North Carolina because I know North Carolina, and I've earned it here in North Carolina. And I keep having people say to me, come lead us, come tell us what to do. And Barbara, I think, fortunately, is getting out of that and is less inclined to do what he did here with us today, because he knows leadership's got to come up. So part of what we can say to you is thank you for what you're doing. It matters so much, and it matters so much because you're there and you know the culture and you know what has to be done. And I think any of us would be happy to talk with you, but I think it's got to come from out of the native soil if it's going to change the hearts of the people who are in that area. And we got to figure out ways to support you in what you're doing in the ways that the movement has figured out how to support some of us in North Carolina that have gotten that attention. You want to talk about Washington?
Let me just say, in response to the comment about the DC area congregations, I mean, that's something we've actually given quite a bit of thought to and have some real interest in. We thought at one time, like, what if we took all of the DC area congregations and each of them kind of paired up with a different part of North Carolina. Let's just take North Carolina for example. And you all went down to Asheville and worked with Mark's congregation. Some folks went to Raleigh. That'd be, not only would we make a difference in voter registration in that state, but we would be making so many friends and growing our movement amongst ourselves, and that would be just such a beautiful thing. So. Please do talk to me or Pam or Patrice, because we'd be really interested in that. So thank you. Yeah.
Wanted to address the folks who may find themselves in a place where it's not obvious that there are folks that want to do the work. I want to raise up, is Robin here? Yes, Reverend Robin Tanner is in sort of a North Charlotte area. And one of the things that they're doing, so they're not necessarily in the bigger city of Charlotte, but more out in small towns. So one of the things that they're doing, and this is something if you saw Selma, that you got a little glimpse of this, is that they have house parties. So they're pulling together in small groups, people who sit down, have a meal together, get to know each other, right? Build relationships that way. So it's not necessarily, we're a big organization and we're going to come to another big organization, or we are an organization that's going to reach out to another organization and somehow figure out how, from the top down, we're going to work together. But more, how can we be in relationship with each other? Pam mentioned the fact that when we went to Charlotte, we had dinner that very first night at the Piedmont Church, and we got to know each other, then we spent the day together, actually out in the field, talking to people, registering folks, and then came back and had another meal together. Those kinds of things, breaking bread, is really a great way to make those relationships. So in places where you're trying to gather those small groups of folks who may be feeling vulnerable, right? Because they think, oh, everyone around me, right, is not in agreement with me. If you can find those folks and bring them together, have a meal, right? Or somehow get together and get to know each other one-on-one. That can be very powerful. And it's the beginning of building something bigger. Yeah.
So I just wanted to follow up on the what I call the indirect disenfranchisement problem, which is low turnout. So there's direct disenfranchisement. We all know what that looks like. But all that creates an atmosphere that voting is hard, right? It's complicated, and it doesn't matter. I mean, I don't have any power to undo these things that are being imposed. And I got a life. I got kids, I got a job, I got 2 jobs. The polls are only open from X time to X time. I'm confused because they changed my place. I mean, there's a million ways, right? And I I commend the League and the other organizations that are out there every day trying to pull down those barriers bit by bit. But that's something we can do, right? That's, that's why people actually were kind of frustrated at some point that we only want to be talking to the people that were turned away because of ID, right? That's how I feel like I'm having an impact. And to really say, first of all, remember, we're not running the strategy, right? These are the voters that the organizations we're partnering with think are the important voters to talk to, and we're helping them overcome all these barriers by making sure they know when and where and how to vote, and using all that great empirically tested language we know helps people turn out, right? You're supposed to tell them that voting is great and that they're voters, and you don't talk about how hard and horrible it is. So those are all things we can do too, right? And they're not as sexy as taking on the laws directly, but they're really, really important.
Let me say at a practical level, we've talked a little bit about Democracy NC, and I commend, check out their website and what they're doing and how they're approaching that issue. So on our second Saturday, it was the Saturday that folks in DC were on the phones, and we in Charlotte were on the streets, and we were going out with cards and getting commitments from people to actually show up and vote. One of the things that we did together on the prior Saturday, because it was enough in advance of the election, you could have a commitment card that you were committing to vote. We took your name and your email or your mailing address, whatever you preferred, and Democracy NC would send them a sample ballot. So for people who say, gosh, it is so daunting, and we're like your state, there are a whole lot of things way down ballot that you didn't even know that existed. Didn't even know there were folks doing that. And it is confusing. So this, at a very practical level, Democracy NC is doing amazing work of getting that. So you get a knock on the door, you sign a commitment card, you get a sample ballot. If you need a ride, you call Democracy NC, and one of their local representatives comes to your house and takes you to your polling place. That's how much they care about the democratic process. If you go to dinner tonight and you spend X number of dollars, I invite you to tie that same amount to some organization doing this work. So if you can't find anybody else, my friends at Democracy NC would love your support. Tell them I sent you. I'll get a cut. No, it's not true. But, that's the other thing. We've got to figure out how to support people larger than us. We're not going to fix this. All 160,000 adults of us aren't going to fix this, right? We've got to have partners, and we've got to support them with our resources of time and energy and money. We've got to if we really care, we've got to put our money into some places, and God loved the League of Women Voters. My neighbor across the street wrangles me at the mailbox every day. He's the former president of the League in North Carolina, and I can't even get my paper without her giving me the latest update on what the League's doing. God love the League. If you want to give the same amount you spend on dinner tonight to the League of Women Voters, you'll have a much better night's sleep tonight, I promise you.
So I want to throw some love at UUA in a very specific way, which is that, so obviously I feel quite strongly about the, spiritual component of this. In a practical way, what I was saying is that be sure that you are getting some multicultural competency training. We did that, yep, and we discovered, we made everybody actually go through that, and we had one person who, not of our congregation, who sort of managed to not go through that, and it convinced us that, yes, you either have to go through it or you have to prove that you've gone through something else, because it really makes a huge difference. And the UUA has resources and can connect you up with folks who can do that. But that really, if you're thinking about getting into this work, please be sure that that is a piece of what you're doing.
Because registering people to vote, getting them out to vote, we can do that in all kinds of places all the time, and that tells people they matter to us. So I just really want to thank this great panel who have shared an incredible, I like people who think big, and these guys are thinking big, so let's just keep thinking big with them. Thank you.